Gobi Desert stretches across northern China and southern Mongolia, covering more than 1.3 million square kilometers. It is not a desert of continuous dunes. Much of it is gravel plain, stone plateau, and hard-packed earth, broken by low ridges and dry basins. Vegetation is sparse. Shrubs grow low to the ground. In some seasons, thin grass appears after brief rains. Most of the year, the land is exposed. Temperatures shift without moderation. Summer days can exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Winter nights fall far below freezing. Wind moves constantly across the open ground. It lifts sand into the air and carries it across long distances. Visibility can narrow quickly during storms, then return to clarity within hours. Water sources are limited and unreliable. Many riverbeds remain dry for most of the year. Wells are scattered and often far apart. Settlements lie at wide intervals, separated by dozens or hundreds of kilometers. There are no natural boundaries to guide the eye. The horizon remains flat and uninterrupted. Sound carries differently here. The wind is often the only movement. It is within this expanse where distance becomes abstract and scale loses, meaning that a solitary figure once began a march that would extend for approximately 600 kilometers across one of the most unforgiving regions in Asia. In the mid-20th century, the northern frontier of China underwent repeated political campaigns that reshaped daily life across Inner Mongolia and adjacent provinces. Land reform, collectivization, and later political movements during the 1950s and 1960s disrupted established patterns of pastoral and rural existence. Administrative boundaries shifted, local leaders were replaced, many civilians were reassigned to labor units far from their homes. Large infrastructure and agricultural projects required manpower in remote areas. Individuals from farming villages and urban centers were transported to sparsely populated regions to work in state farms, mining operations, or construction brigades. Records from this period describe relocations to marginal lands near the Gobi's edge, where soil was poor and water scarce. Transportation was often conducted by truck convoys or rail to distant outposts, followed by overland transfer to smaller work sites. Among those affected were young men and women with limited experience in desert travel. Some had agricultural backgrounds. Others had been students or clerks prior to reassignment. Survival skills varied. A minority possessed knowledge of steppe navigation or livestock management, but many did not. Equipment provided to labor units was basic. Supplies were distributed according to state planning schedules, which could be disrupted by weather or logistical failure. In several documented cases from Inner Mongolia, during the late 1950s and early 1960s, transport vehicles broke down between settlements, leaving work teams temporarily stranded. Mechanical failure was common. Spare parts were scarce in isolated regions. Communication systems were limited. Radio access was not always available to small convoys, and road networks were poorly marked. One such incident involved a labor transport traveling across a remote corridor near the southern Gobi. The route connected a regional rail line to a state agricultural site farther inland. The journey required crossing extended stretches of open terrain with no permanent infrastructure. The passengers carried limited water and provisions intended only for the scheduled duration of travel. The broader context was not one of exploration or voluntary expedition. These were not trained desert travelers preparing for an endurance crossing. They were civilians in transit under administrative direction, moving between assigned locations in a politically charged environment where refusal was not an option. Their presence near the desert was incidental to policy, not personal ambition. It was within this framework, mechanical fragility, limited supplies, and vast terrain that a sequence of events unfolded, leading to one individual becoming separated from organized support and facing a landscape measured not in hours, but in hundreds of kilometers. The transport convoy departed along a graded dirt track that cut across the southern margin of the Gobi. The route was not paved. It was marked only by tire impressions and intermittent posts placed at irregular intervals. The distance between the rail junction and the agricultural site was estimated at several hundred kilometers. Under normal conditions, the journey required more than a full day of travel. Mechanical problems began before midday. One of the trucks developed engine failure. According to later accounts recorded in regional archives, the convoy halted while attempts were made to repair the vehicle. Tools were limited. Replacement components were not available. The delay extended into the afternoon. As daylight declined, a decision was made to redistribute passengers and cargo between the remaining vehicles to continue toward the destination. Space was insufficient for everyone. Some were instructed to wait temporarily with the disabled truck, while assistance was expected to return from the nearest settlement. The separation was not initially understood as permanent. Distances in the Gobi are deceptive. A settlement that appears close may lie many hours away. With the sun lowering and temperatures beginning to drop, visibility shifted as shadows lengthened across the plain. During the night, wind intensified. Sand reduced clarity. When morning came, orientation was less certain. The graded track had become partially obscured. Those left behind attempted to determine direction based on memory of the previous day's travel. The horizon offered few reference points. At some stage during these movements, whether through misjudgment of direction or attempt to locate the main route, one individual became physically separated from the remaining group. Accounts differ on the precise moment. What is documented is that organized contact was lost. The decision that followed was not dramatic. It was practical. Waiting without water was not sustainable. Movement became the only option. Morning light in the Gobi arrives without obstruction. There are no forests to soften it and no mountains in the immediate vicinity to delay it. The sky clears quickly after night wind. By sunrise, the temperature begins to rise. With organized contact lost, the first task was orientation. The graded track that had guided the convoy was no longer clearly visible. Tire marks had been dispersed by shifting sand and gravel. Wooden markers were absent from the immediate area. There was no compass. Direction had to be estimated from memory and observation. The previous day's travel had moved generally southwest from the rail junction toward the agricultural site. The position of the rising sun provided a fixed reference. By aligning movement relative to the east in the morning and adjusting as the sun advanced, a general bearing could be maintained. This method is imprecise but sufficient for large-scale direction if consistency is preserved. Distance was more difficult to judge. In open desert terrain, scale is deceptive. A ridge that appears near may require hours to reach. Heat shimmer alters perception. To avoid circular movement, a distant point along the horizon was selected and used as a temporary marker. Upon reaching it, another point was chosen farther ahead. Progress was measured by repetition of this process. Water supplies were limited to what had been carried during transit. Rations were not intended for extended exposure. Movement during peak midday heat would accelerate dehydration. The decision was made to walk during the cooler hours of morning and late afternoon, resting when the sun reached its highest point. There was no certainty about the nearest settlement. The only assumption was that a rail line and inhabited corridor existed in the general direction from which the convoy had come. Returning toward known infrastructure increased the probability of encountering assistance. The choice to walk rather than remain stationary was calculated. Remaining near the disabled vehicle would depend on rescue that might not arrive quickly. Moving introduced risk, but created possibility. With a bearing established and limited supplies secured, the march began step by step across ground that offered no shade, no clear boundary, and no indication of how far 600 kilometers would feel underfoot. The quantity of water available at the outset was small. Transport between settlements had been calculated to last a fixed number of hours, not days. Containers were not designed for prolonged isolation. Each swallow required consideration. In arid environments, dehydration advances in stages. Thirst appears first, followed by dryness of the mouth and lips. As fluid loss increases, urine output declines. Headache and fatigue follow. Judgment can weaken before physical collapse becomes visible. Managing intake, therefore, becomes a balance between immediate relief and long-term survival. The initial approach was rationing by interval rather than by desire. Small amounts were consumed at set times during the day. Walking was restricted to cooler periods to slow fluid loss through sweat. Clothing was kept on despite heat to reduce direct exposure to sunlight. Covering the head provided limited protection from radiant heat. Dry riverbeds occasionally crossed the plain. These depressions offered faint possibility. In some regions of the Gobi, Shallow digging near the lowest point of a dry channel can produce damp soil, though not always drinkable water. Attempts were made where terrain suggested former flow. The ground, however, was often hard and unyielding. Without tools, excavation was minimal. No reliable source was found in the early stages. Food rations were even more limited than water. Caloric intake was reduced to conserve bodily reserves. Hunger, while uncomfortable, is more survivable than dehydration in the short term. The priority remained fluid. Wind intensified during parts of the afternoon. Fine particles entered the mouth and nose. Moisture evaporated quickly. Lips cracked. Walking pace slowed to conserve energy. Rest periods lengthened. There are documented cases from desert crossings in northern China, where individuals survived by maintaining strict ration discipline during the first several days, delaying critical dehydration long enough to approach inhabited corridors. Whether such discipline could be sustained depended on mental control as much as physical condition. By the end of the first sustained stretch of travel, water levels had fallen significantly. No external source had been located. The remaining supply no longer represented comfort. It represented time. Distance in the Gobi is cumulative. There are no markers indicating progress. The ground does not change significantly from one hour to the next. Gravel plains give way to compacted earth, then to stretches of loose sand, then back again. Elevation shifts gradually. Low ridges appear and recede. The rhythm of travel settled into repetition. Movement began shortly after dawn. Steps were measured and consistent. Pauses were brief and timed. When the sun climbed high and the air became unstable with heat shimmer, walking stopped. Rest took place in minimal shade created by shallow depressions in the terrain or by the shadow of a pack placed upright. In late afternoon, movement resumed until light declined. Footwear deteriorates quickly under such conditions. Stones abrade soles. Heat softens material. Blisters form, then rupture. Each step after that requires adjustment. Slower pace becomes necessary. In long desert marches documented in northern Asia, foot injury often becomes a decisive factor. Infection risk increases when skin breaks and hygiene is limited. Sandstorms interrupted progress more than once. Wind in the Gobi can intensify within minutes. Fine particles reduce visibility and alter direction. During such events, forward motion becomes inefficient and disorienting. On at least one occasion, walking was suspended until visibility improved. Remaining stationary conserved strength but extended the timeline. Estimating total distance traveled is difficult without instruments. Later reconstruction based on known rail lines and settlement spacing suggests that the crossing approached 600 kilometers. At an average of 20 to 30 kilometers per day under harsh conditions, such a journey would require several weeks. That estimate assumes consistent forward direction and absence of prolonged immobilization. Weight loss became evident. Clothing hung more loosely. Muscle fatigue accumulated. Yet forward motion continued. There is no dramatic moment during extended endurance marches. There is only accumulation of steps, of heat exposure, of fatigue. The horizon remains unchanged. The body adjusts until it can no longer do so. By this stage, the remaining water supply had diminished to critical levels. The route ahead remained undefined. Infrastructure had not yet appeared. Extended isolation alters perception gradually. In open desert terrain, sensory input is limited. Sound is reduced to wind and the movement of loose gravel. Visual variation is minimal. Days resemble one another. Without external markers, time becomes difficult to measure precisely. To maintain orientation and prevent mental drift, routine becomes essential. Waking at first light, walking at fixed intervals, and resting at predictable times provided structure. Counting steps over short distances created manageable units of progress. Repetition replaced uncertainty. Memory can serve as both anchor and distraction. Recalling familiar places or past events offers continuity, but excessive reflection may weaken concentration on immediate tasks. Documented survival accounts from arid crossings note the importance of focusing attention on physical actions rather than imagined outcomes. In this case, movement itself became the primary occupation of thought. Sleep was shallow. Night temperatures dropped sharply. Without shelter, rest was interrupted by cold and wind. Dreams were fragmented. Fatigue accumulated not only from walking but from insufficient recovery. Visual distortion can occur during dehydration. Heat shimmer along the horizon produces the appearance of water or distant structures. Recognizing mirage as optical effect requires restraint. Chasing illusions wastes energy. Observations were therefore tested by gradual approach rather than immediate change in direction. Loneliness in such conditions is not expressed through outward display. It manifests as narrowing of attention. Language is absent. Decision-making becomes internal and deliberate. By maintaining consistent bearing and routine, forward progress continued. Yet cognitive strain increased as physical reserves declined. The landscape did not change. No settlement appeared. The horizon remained open, and the body grew lighter with each passing day. By the third week of sustained travel, physical reserves were severely reduced. Exact dates are uncertain, as no written record was kept during the crossing. Later, testimony indicated that the journey extended beyond 20 days. Caloric intake had been minimal. Water had been exhausted for periods at a time before limited moisture was located in isolated depressions. Signs of advanced dehydration appeared. Skin lost elasticity. Lips split deeply. Urine output nearly ceased. Walking pace declined to intervals, measured in short advances, followed by prolonged rest. Dizziness increased when standing. Vision narrowed during midday heat. Attempts to locate permanent water intensified. Dry channels were examined more frequently. In one instance, shallow moisture was extracted by scraping damp sediment into cloth and compressing it. The yield was small. It extended survival but did not restore strength. Disorientation occurred intermittently. Bearings established earlier in the journey required reevaluation. Without a compass, maintaining straight-line travel over hundreds of kilometers is improbable. Later mapping suggests that the route likely included deviations before realignment toward inhabited corridors. At least one attempt to change direction in search of visible structures resulted in lost time. Distant formations that appeared artificial resolved into natural rock outcrops upon approach. Energy expended during these detours further reduced capacity. Body mass declined significantly. Muscle tissue diminished. Foot injuries deepened. Walking became uneven. During rest periods, rising required deliberate effort. There were episodes in which continued movement was uncertain. Survival accounts from extreme desert crossings indicate that collapse often occurs abruptly after prolonged compensation. The body maintains function until reserves are nearly exhausted, then declines rapidly. In this case, forward motion did not cease entirely. It slowed to its minimum sustainable pace. The psychological effect of nearing physical limits is not dramatic. It is narrowing. Attention compresses to immediate necessity: standing, stepping, breathing. Infrastructure had still not been confirmed. Yet, according to later verification, the remaining distance to a railway corridor was decreasing. The first confirmed sign of infrastructure appeared not as a building, but as geometry. A linear form interrupted the horizon. Unlike natural ridges, it extended without curvature. Approach was gradual and cautious, consistent with earlier experience of visual distortion. As distance closed, wooden sleepers and steel rails became distinguishable. The line corresponded with a regional railway corridor documented in northern China during that period. The presence of rail indicated proximity to settlements or maintenance posts, though not necessarily immediate assistance. Crossing the final stretch required sustained effort. Physical condition had deteriorated to severe depletion. Later reports indicate significant weight loss and extensive foot injury. Dehydration had not fully resolved. However, reaching the rail line altered probability. Tracks imply direction. Following them reduces uncertainty. Movement shifted parallel to the rails. Railway infrastructure increases the likelihood of encountering personnel, passing trains, or service structures within measurable distance. The environment remained exposed, but orientation was no longer abstract. Eventual contact occurred near a maintenance point along the corridor. Records confirm that the individual was discovered in a state of extreme exhaustion and transported for medical attention. The estimated total distance of travel, reconstructed from known departure and arrival points, approached 600 kilometers. There was no public announcement at the time. Survival was documented in administrative records rather than celebrated. Recovery required extended care. The crossing ended not with arrival at a town square, but with the quiet confirmation that movement across open desert had reached an inhabited line. The march across approximately 600 kilometers of the Gobi was not undertaken for exploration or recognition. It emerged from administrative displacement, mechanical failure, and the absence of immediate rescue. Documentation of the event survives in regional accounts and later testimony, though precise measurements vary. As with many survival incidents from periods of political upheaval, records are limited and sometimes inconsistent. What remains consistent is the scale of the landscape and the measurable distance covered on foot under conditions of scarcity. The Gobi does not impose narrative structure. It offers exposure, distance, and climate. Survival within it depends on orientation, rationing, and sustained movement. There was no transformation of character recorded afterward, no formal expedition report, and no commemorative marker placed along the route. The event exists as a documented endurance crossing within a broader historical context of displacement. In arid regions, survival is often determined by incremental decisions rather than singular acts. Step followed step. Direction was maintained. Infrastructure was eventually reached. The desert returned to its usual silence.